Hey, everybody. Welcome. So, I have with me today Jared Napolitano, who is the marketing advocate for the Star Wars Players Committee. Jared, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody real quick?
Sure. Yeah, Matt, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I am the marketing advocate for the Players Committee as of about a year ago. I guess my story with the game quickly is I got first familiar with the game back in 1997 after Dagobah came out. I started playing more competitively probably after Jabba's Palace was released in 1998. Played a lot of tournaments in 99, 2000, 2001 in the Philadelphia area. Um, did well, but I didn't ever really travel with the game. But always loved it and met a lot of great people. And then I kind of had a hiatus for about 15 years. Came back to the game in 2017, right after Rogue One. And I think there's a lot of people in the game who came back around then and just gradually started playing the game on Jemp, going to locals, went to a couple majors, and just started meeting more people and just immersing myself in the community and getting involved from a volunteer perspective and just started having a lot more success really in the last 2 years too. Actually playing the game and had some solid performances at majors, and have really enjoyed being the marketing advocate over the past year and being able to impact players in the game and potential players back to the game. And just it's just interesting. One of the things that always fascinates me is just how people come in and out of the game. They take a 1 year break, they take a 15-year break, they just start learning. In 2015, maybe they,
I
it's
took
really
like a
neat.
22-year break, right? So,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
totally get it.
yeah.
Um, so, actually, one of the things maybe for folks that aren't familiar, could you just quickly give like the 20-second version of what the PC is and what they kind of do to
Mhm.
keep the game going? So, it's a dead card game. None's being printed, but what does the players committee kind of do? Where do they fit in?
Yeah, so the Players Committee is now celebrating its 20 years of existence. Back in 2002, when Decipher lost the license, there was an agreement between Lucasfilm, Decipher, and the Players Committee to be stewards of the game and, with some restrictions, be able to produce more cards. And for the last 20 years, the Players Committee, in my opinion, has done a great job of making sure that tournaments are happening, putting out new cards, designing new cards, um, just doing everything, making prize support, marketing the game, helping building future players and communities, and really just being the glue for the game in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely. I've been really impressed. I mean, we have the website right here. So, if
Mhm.
folks want to check it out, just the resources available. When I kind of stumbled my way back into this game in 2020, 2021, there
Mhm.
was just so many good resources on the website, whether it's collecting, whether it's
Mhm.
figuring out how to play, or the topic we want to kind of cover today is the virtual sets.
Mhm.
And before I forget, I do want to say that we're going to raffle off some really
Mhm.
fun and interesting prizes. Jared, do you want to
Yeah.
show those off?
Yeah, I have one which is a oversized foil objective. The galaxy may need a legend, and we need Luke Skywalker. And this is a pretty good objective. It's playable now. I would say it's a tier one light side deck. So I have an extra one of these we can give
So
away.
that's one of the virtual cards from set.
Yep.
Like, so these sets we see virtual cards set,
Yeah,
virtual
set
set 17.
11.
That's the set 11. So this is one of these virtual cards we're going to be talking about.
Yep. Yeah, and then I also have we'll call it an uncut sheet. This is alternate image cards, which we'll talk about a little bit too. These are virtual cards that have alternate image counterparts that kind of came out, and it's a poster. It's not too big, but it's pretty neat. And one key thing, just so we don't forget about this, one of the really great things for the game, in all honesty, was in 2014 there was a card pool reset where they basically went back to the Decipher cards and a 100 card base set. And I think that was a tremendous thing for the game because if you're coming into the game in like 2012, there's a lot of cards you need to learn. At that point, the PC was doing making cards for 10 years and Decipher made cards for 6 years. So it's just a lot of cards to get a hold of. So it really lowered the barrier to entry to kind of just reset. Let's keep a base set of 100 cards that are solid, staple. These have been through iterations. They're not overpowered, but they're really ways to kind of clean up some of the overpowered stuff at the
Mhm.
end of the Decipher era, and that's why we're up to set 17 now. About two, three, yeah, more like four sets a year.
Okay. So I guess this is a really good segue to just kind of get into virtual cards. So I'm gonna use my own perspective here.
Mhm.
I've never used virtual cards, and I feel that they're a little daunting, right? I've never been a great arts and crafts guy. So
Mhm.
can you kind of tell me what is the best way for people that might be returning to the game that are very used to the Decipher only format, or maybe Premiere to Death Star 2 to
Mhm.
get into virtual cards, and how does one do that?
Yeah. I could speak from my personal experience, which I think has worked pretty well because I've definitely noticed in retrospect I've grown a lot as a player um, over the past 5 years. But when I came back, I first started playing Premier Death Star 2 on Gemp, played with some buddies I knew from a long time ago, and then what I did was I looked at some of the more recent majors that happened. I looked at some of the top decks. I looked at familiar decks that I knew like Prophet and Hunt Down. So I know they're still playing this objective. This objective is not completely obsolete. And I basically what I did was I pulled up 3, 4 versions of the same archetype of 3, 4 profit decks, and especially a couple names I recognize like Greg Shaw and Steve Baroni, strong players. And I basically just looked at, okay, they're basically playing across 4 decks the same 80 cards or a width of 80 cards, I'll say. So I basically just started net decking is the term, and playing those decks and just kind of trimming and getting used to it. And I jumped in the deep end of the pool and just gradually started immersing myself with shields and virtual cards. And yeah, they do seem daunting. It seems like there's a lot. There's almost 800 right now through I guess it's 18 sets because there's a set 0. But that's the approach I took. And you're definitely going to take your licks. You're going to lose a bunch of games, but you just got to, know that there are people who are very helpful in the community. There's a ton of resources to get better, but those virtual cards do a lot of, in my opinion, they get out some, really annoying strategies. They also try to make a lot of cards that Decipher made playable, that themes that this deck just wasn't strong enough. They missed the mark, so they've created some helpers over time for that. So that was my approach. And another approach I take instead of trying to drink from a fire hose is what I would do from the collector in me is when there's a new set, maybe there's 20 cards, I'll print out the PDF. I'll see if I have the underlying cards in my collection. If I don't, I'll, order some of them, and then I'll put them in my binders and sleeve them. So I pretty much always have one of every virtual card in my binder. And then there's a couple virtual cards you want to play 3, 4 copies of. But those, and then especially when you're going to locals or majors, especially, you have to do the arts and crafts, cut them, sleeve them in. But it's cool that they're free. So it's kind of it's a trade-off I think that pretty much everyone will make instead of chasing certain rares, that you'd rather just, cut up some full slips, half slips, C slips, slip them over the underlying card, put your sleeves together with your decks and play it that way. So that would be my approach.
Yeah, I think it's really so. Just a couple quick thoughts. First off, we're going to mention Gemp. If anyone doesn't know, that is a free platform online to play Star Wars CCG. I'll include it in the description just in case anyone's not familiar with it. But I think it's just amazing that after 20 years of being out of print, there's still a meta and it's evolving and changing. And that's really fascinating. And from what I understand, like the virtual card sets aren't huge. They're not like dropping 180 cards, at one time. The virtual sets are like 20 cards at a time. And you mentioned 800 cards, but it's only because there's been 18 sets, and some of it's errated as well. So it doesn't have to necessarily be you need to print out 800 cards. You can just look at the last 3 or 4, frankly, ones that thematically are interesting to you. And as you mentioned, they're also free. There's a PDF you can just print out. And
there's a master PDF. Yep.
Yeah, so maybe you could talk about slips and how that works a little bit. Like, how do you use these? If you want to just like, pick up a kitchen table game and play with the new set, the virtual set 18, I understand it's coming out. How would you kind of do that?
Yeah, so what'll happen with a key aspect of this, going back before Jump was around, before the cards were live, which now they're basically live simultaneous. It's even with the PDF. There would be a PDF that's available on the website, SWCCG.org. You can download it. People take it to Office Max. They get it printed. Sometimes they print it at home. Sometimes they print it at work. And basically, so you have these sheets, and there's 3 types of slips. There's full slips, which are like a full card, where they're easy. We like those because you just basically rectangular, snip, snip, and then a lot of people double sleeve their cards. They'll put it over the underlying card, which is always specified of what you need. And we could talk about those too, but the PC does make a conscious effort to try to make the underlying cards commons pretty much as possible. And then there's half slips, which are, they're pretty much just the bottom half or bottom third a lot of times of a card, and those are easy to cut as well. And then there's C slips, which are kind of a pain because they look like a C. They basically keep the image of the Decipher card, but the title changes, the destiny might change, the game text might change, and those are trickier to, especially with the locations. They're the worst. C-slip locations are a pain in the butt. But fortunately, like our graphics department, one of the many groups under the Players Committee, has just continuously been making strides and doing more and more full slips. And a lot of times they're doing alternate images of sometimes maybe there was a half slip that was made and now they're doing a full slip of it. And those are always fantastic images, and they're just getting better and better. But yeah, it seems kind of crazy. A lot of people, might say, "Oh, I need the cardboard," but when the cards are sleeved and in decks, and now there's anywhere from like 20 to maybe 45 at most on some of the newer decks that are especially themed off of the more recent Star Wars content. Um, the you do it, you sleeve it up, and you can't really tell within the deck. You're shuffling, you ask your opponent to cut, all that stuff. So a skeptic might be like, well, isn't that kind of like marking the cards by knowing certain ones are thicker than others? And there's just so many virtual cards in a deck that to really have that happen is kind of tricky. And usually people use pretty thin paper too. So.
Yeah, so I think one thing you mentioned there is that the virtual sets they continue to grow the Star Wars universe, right? So it's using content from like Rebels, or I think the latest one has you're not quite to Boba Fett, Book of Boba Fett.
Yeah, it's a couple of Boba Fett.
So it's continuing to kind of move with the Star Wars universe as well, which obviously some of that stuff maybe people don't love the new movies, but I think there's some I love Rebels, man. I would just like run with those guys all day.
Rebels is great, yeah.
So I think that's just a lot of fun to keep on kind of adding to this growing Star Wars universe. Maybe we'll see, some of the even the shorts. What were those called on Disney? The Origins or no?
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, there's like Chelly Afra, who's I think just a comic mostly. Like it's pretty cool that the PC, the design arm of the PC is constantly touching on different areas. And with every set that comes out, and this might be a question we were going to touch upon anyway, but it's interesting. Like usually with each set, there's like a general theme, but there's also a lot of like random ones a lot of times, and that's for a few reasons. One, it might be a way to address the current meta. Like maybe there's a certain deck that's really strong that there might be some type of soft counter to it.
It's like a hot fix or something.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes that. Yeah, and then there's player cards which are neat because those are given out, for accomplishments or exceptional volunteerism or doing really well at an event, and that's where certain players can go through the design process with members of the player card team, and they fine tune a card that they're looking to do. Maybe it's something very personal to them for a deck they really like. They want to make a helper. Maybe it's more of a fun, not necessarily they're making them to be tier 1 cards that are included every deck, but that's where they're, every set that comes out is maybe 3, 4, 5 player cards that are dropped in. And like in the most recent set 17, I mean, there was a wide range of decks that were touched upon. Like we had a Lightside Mara Jade, we had a Wookiee from like episode 3, we had Boba from Book of Boba Fett, Bo-Katan, like Communing Jedi, and effective just demonstration. So a little bit of like Rogue One stuff. So it had a lot of everything. And some sets are a little more like heavy, and maybe they're 90% a certain theme, like virtual set 4, 5, 6. That was when Force Awakens was out. But it is neat that I think that there's each set that comes along helps a bunch of things. And if some people like playing certain decks, they might be like, okay, there's 5 cards in this set that I'm going to put in my decks, and the other ones I'm not really going to use. But it's neat how a lot of times that cards that might be made in set 5 don't really start having synergy with other cards until set 10. So it's really neat and interesting, and how things
so that's kind of one thing I wanted to talk about. So I will confess I play Magic. I play Magic the Gathering. And one thing I'll say about playing Magic in 2022 is the game has just evolved immensely from what it was in 2002. And Star Wars CCG is 25 years old at this point, and I kind of wanted to ask, what do the virtual cards do to modernize the format a little bit to kind of bring this CCG from the 90s into the modern era, as far as maybe tutors or just helping players pull cards, or just making the game a little less like RNG focused, which I feel like that was one of my complaints as a kid. If you get a crappy hand, there's no mulligan, right? Like, you might just have a crappy hand.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what some of the most impactful virtual cards do is they make old strategies, archetypes, other Decipher cards playable. A perfect example of this would be Boba Fett's Blaster Rifle virtual. That's a card that really was never used, and it was actually a player card by Lenny Rubin several sets ago, and really just over the last 4 or 5 sets, that carbon chamber testing objective from Special Edition, it has a flip version now where it makes it much more plausible for you to deliver the captive to the audience chamber. So
it was like impossible. It was so clunky. I mean, those about all the objectives really from the Cypher eras are so clunky. Like I want Rebel Strike Team to work, but it's like impossible to actually.
There's a couple of virtual helpers for Rebel Strike Team I know right now. What design's trying to do is they're always trying to make sure that decks are maybe they're not tier one, but make them like tier two. But Boba Fett's blaster rifle lets you like basically relocate Boba and the captive to the audience chambers. You don't have to do the long slog from the security tower all the way to the audience chamber. So it enables you to flip the objective and actually then get the benefits of the 7 side before you've like lost already. And
Mhm.
my favorite deck to play is or probably one of my favorites with Prophet, but also Agents of Black Sun. And you might remember from the Premier Reflections 2 era, like one of the problems with Agents of Black Sun then is there's like no Coruscant sites and there's no battleground Coruscant system. So what some of the virtual cards that pertain to Agents of Black Sun do is there's an Imperial City that's virtualized that allows you to download or pull from your reserve deck tutor a Vigo virtual. And what the Vigo virtual does is allows you to get out a battleground location, which is Shizor's Palace, which then allows you to pull out other Shizor's Palace sites. So you go from you actually have Coruscant battleground sites. There's a Coruscant V system, which if you have a Black Sun agent there, it basically adds one icon for both players, so it turns it into a battleground. So you can do battle plan that way. You can have this a credible space. It makes sense to have space in your deck, so
Mhm.
it just makes the deck balanced. It increases access. There's a bunch of decks that you want to get key characters out. Like mine would you have learned back in the day, like that would help you get out your apprentice and your mentor. There's a deck Shadow Collective now, which is based off of Solo to some extent, but basically, or most of this extent, allows you to download Maul from your reserve decks. And Maul is critical because he's the kind of invisible hand and kind of the Shadow Collective. And if you had to play 5 Mauls in your deck to make sure that you were able to get him out, it just dilutes your destiny. It dilutes the whole process. And that's where, like, you might be familiar with the Premier to New Hope League right now. What happened a lot, I think, back in the day is people would just draw, find their cards, find their locations. Now you want to be able to get your locations out, get the key characters out. So then you can actually do stuff like control locations, have battles, and just actually do the fun stuff about Star Wars CCG and
Mhm.
not the bad stuff of drawing 15 cards in your hand. Oh no, Monarch used. Now what do I do? Like instead of that game of getting your activation out, a lot of the virtual cards help get that stuff going. So then you it accelerates the game for sure. But it has a lot of benefits.
Well, I'm kind of happy to hear that because I will say that I've been playing the Premier to New Hope Throwback League, and man, does it feel kind of clunky at times where you
Yeah.
just have this huge hand. And comparing this experience, and I will say that I like the cards I've kind of collected and then gotten back into playing a little bit and
Mhm.
experimented with different formats. And to hear that virtual cards kind of help modernize the game is
Mhm.
really nice to hear, and kind of reaffirming, because
Yeah.
I think this game has immense potential going forward. It just there are some of these like expectations in 2022 that you have with a game, and
Mhm.
it's you don't want to have a 20 card hand.
Yeah, it's funny because there's so often where we're playing the game and we're like, "Oh, Neighbor leads a premier card being impactful." It could be worse being impactful. So it's not like if you know nothing about virtual cards, don't have the idea that all my old cards are obsolete. First of all, a lot of them, especially the really bad ones, like are underlying cards. Like "Hear Me, Baby, Hold Together" is a common from Premier that is an awful card, but "Hear Me, Baby, Virtual" is a really good virtual card that's in a ton of decks because it does a bunch of different things and that's where it's really neat doing that. But then also, it's just funny. And you made a comment earlier that made me think of this. It's just there's so often that we're like, oh wow, that card was made 25 years ago, and it's still good, it's still playable. Or conversely, because this game is so beautiful and so complex, that someone will break something, or there'll be some crazy interaction that oh wow, like a couple years ago, Chief Bast. If anyone's familiar with Chief Bast's game text, basically Chief Bast was broken. That you could evacuate from the system and stay in the ship, and then or I think it was like you said, stay at the site, and it had like this broken link where we did a rare thing as a players committee was errata a decipher card, which is something that really doesn't happen. But if there's a really weird interaction that's unintended, that'll happen. But that's another benefit of virtual cards too. Like there's kind of this, the design doesn't want to errata stuff. They usually prefer to make new cards, or maybe to a lesser extent if they have to shield certain things. But if there's a card that just doesn't hit the mark, or it's too strong or too weak, they can tweak it. And instead of you having to go out and buy a brand new card, you print off another slip, you update your slip. So some of those happen just to make sure that the game experience is, so a lot of people are complaining, hey, this deck is way too strong. I have no idea how to beat it. Design's really good at addressing that stuff. And it's just, frankly, it's a lot easier to do it with virtual cards than, the other alternatives.
So, kind of continuing along here, How often do the new sets come out? I think you mentioned three times a year, two slash three times a year. Is that sort of what to expect?
Yeah, I would say every 3 months. There have been a couple. They've never been less than 3 months. There was a couple times where I think there might have been a 8, 9 month
Mhm.
a gap, and it kind of depends. A lot of times the idea is let's make a new set, release it 3, 4 weeks before a new major, let people play with the cards. People always want to see new cards; they're always exciting, and that's a tough balance that design's always trying to strike. Of let's make new cards that are innovative, that have some kind of neat new mechanics, but we don't want to make all these new cards be so powerful that they make everything else obsolete. So it's kind of this fine tune of, and it's interesting seeing like on Jump activity, like you see when there's a new set that comes out, the games go way up. People love to play with new cards. So it's that balance of not making it so constantly changing that the meta, but also consistently making it fresh. And yeah, the sets can range anywhere from, I think there was even some like set 5, I think might have only been like 18 cards. Some have been like around 60 cards. The base set was 100, but I would say the average is probably around 30, which is cool. And a really interesting point about virtual cards is that when these sets come out, remember some of the Decipher cards? I was going through, I was sorting my collection the other day, and I'm like going through some of these Cloud City and Dagobah. I'm like, some of these cards are so bad. They're just total bloat. They're total bloat. Like, and there's such a small percentage of those sets that would be playable cards, especially like 3, 4 sets later. But the virtual cards is a much higher percentage that are playable, usable. Not every card is super powerful, but there's there's very little binder fodder, so to speak. So, and it's for good reason. It's not like the PCs, they're not printing a bunch of cards. They're not doing this whole rare, uncommon, common structure to try to print packs, make money. We're not for profit charitable organization that we're just trying to keep the game going. So there's not an incentive to make cards that are just for collector purposes, but actually for
Mhm.
gameplay purposes. But of course, gameplay for all types of players, for casual players, for competitive players, for semi-competitive players. And there's the different formats that people do with virtual cards to kind of chop off the top of the meta so that, hey, you're tired of playing against the super strong deck all the time. There's that flexibility to say, let's just ban 5 cards for this format. It's really easily done on Jemp. And then people really like that. We call that the Jawa format.
Interesting. So I guess the new sets, they're when they come out, they're not only adding maybe new metas, new mechanics, but sometimes I think like the set 18 has a Imperial Command combo card. So they're also kind of like adding in tech cards. They're adding
Mhm.
in quality of life improvement. I think that's one of the big things that the cards do. So it's not just, hey, there's a new piece of Star Wars IP. We did some cards. There's also like stuff that makes the playing experience better, ideally, right?
Yeah, yeah. A few comments on that. So set 18 had these new cards, which are a very new concept because just as you know, if you came back to the game in 2020, or maybe you don't know because prices in like 2018 versus 2021 or even 2022 are pretty crazy. So the PC made some combo cards that they do some of the functions of very commonly played, very expensive cards, but they're definitely not quite as good, but they're a little different. So design did a really good job of kind of making sure that the other cards, that the expensive cards, they're still good. You still want those ideally, but it also lowered the barrier to entry for newer players of, hey, I can't afford a $75, Mace Windu, or eat Qui-Gon with lightsabers really expensive now. Any of those Theod and Coruscant cards. One thing that the PC does, and this is one of my favorite cards, is they'll make like utility cards that you don't want to have like bullet cards that only counter one specific thing, and then if you don't see that thing, that card's a total waste of space in your precious 60 card deck. With a universe that just keeps growing of more and more good cards, those 60 deck slots are very precious. So that's where they try to make these utility cards, I'll call, like there's Odin Nestlor and First Aid, which like cancels Disarmed. It acts like a more fair neighbor and leads. It also uh, it prevents forfeit from being reduced. It does like a bunch of different things that you could play this card and it's going to probably have a use in most of your games and not be a wasted deck slot. So the PC does a really good job with those types of things to try to balance to balance different things.
So, what would be your suggestion for someone like myself that's returning to the game, or even brand new? I know we do get those folks that kind of stumble across this. How do you start integrating, virtual cards with your fledgling, collection? How does that kind of come together? Or I understand there's the PDF. There's also a master PDF, right, available. Like that, I
Also,
opened it and I was like, oh man, this thing.
yeah,
There's a lot on there. I don't know where to start. So what's a good starting point? Like, do you start with set 0, or do you start with set 18, which I guess comes out in a couple weeks?
Yeah, I wouldn't approach it that way because I know some people when they come back to the game or they're just approaching the game for the first time, they say, "Okay, I'm going to learn Premier meta, then I'm going to learn Premier to New Hope," and that sounds logical, but I really think the better approach is to jump in the deep end of the pool, and that's where I would almost work backwards. I'd almost look, on the website, the deck list for recent events is always posted.
Hmm.
If you jump, and I know somebody who just did this, came back to the game within the last 6 months, and he's gotten really good pretty quickly. He's just playing games and he's just net decking and then playing, figuring out what deck. And this is another great benefit of Gemp is that to play a deck. You don't need to go out, buy all the cards, and then bring them to your tour. Like you can play stuff on Gemp, try different things out. Hey, you like this certain deck? Okay, now go get the cards for that specific deck. And you also are going to be helped out by a lot of virtual cards. And there's a couple decks that are very strong right now that are a lot of virtual cards, so they're not expensive at all to build. You can build like I want that map, or Echo Base Operations, or They Have No Idea We're Coming, which is based off of the Rogue One light side theme. There's a couple other decks that are just not expensive and that are very viable. So I would just kind of look at recent decks, jump into them. You'll realize that there's certain cards that appear in a lot of the same decks. They might be from set 0, they might be from set 5. It might be, you'll see it that way. I wouldn't kind of go chronologically because I just think, especially with new sets coming out every 3 months, by the time you get used to it, there might be some new cards, and then it kind of tweaks the meta and makes certain decks really strong, or might knock down certain decks to balance it. But like I said at the beginning, I print it out, I put it in my binder, I put each set out so I can just flip through. And then if there's certain cards that I need, 3, 4 copies of virtual cards, I have them kind of separate. But I treat them like new cards, like they were just released. And I think that sometimes people might get hung up on the whole virtual card or paper
Hmm.
slips. But at the end of the day, these are just new sets that are being produced. And like I said, there's a lot less bloat in them. And when some people complain about, power creep, it's like, and it's better than me playing other games. It's inevitable with CCGs that power creep's going to happen. It's just we try to make sure it doesn't happen super on an accelerated pace. But like when EPP Luke came out, like the other Lukes took a back seat, and it's just it happened a lot in the Decipher era itself, and it's just natural to happen. And that's where there were 2 resets. Like I said, back in 2014, there was like a fresh reset down to 100, and then back in 2009, the PC did a major overhaul of the cards because they were just noticing, hey, now they've been at that point they were making new cards longer than Decipher was. That 2009, they're making it for 7 years. Decipher was making it for 6.
That's kind of wild.
Yeah, so they just kind of
It's,
chopped it back down. And a really, really key thing to note from that era, we'll call it the early legacy era, and then there was the post legacy era, which I'll call like 2009 to 2014. There were a lot of lessons learned. At some point, there's like a lot of the virtual cards had like super long text boxes, like kerning was this grant. There was just cards that did like way too much. It was way too much to keep straight, and it was really hard for new players. So there's all these guidelines that design follows to say, hey, and especially in terms of, we're not going to virtualize ultra rare cards. We're not going to make super hard cards to get, virtual underlying cards. And that's
mhm.
from the collectability, but then also a lot of design principles of trying to make sure the game doesn't get too power boosted too quickly. But besides, it's kind of
Is
natural.
there like I'm just wondering, is there like a virtual card like I know that there's obviously deck lists for competitive play, but if I as a newer player wanted to just like dip my toes in and like kind of tinker around with like some virtual card deck lists, are those kind of available like mid tier? They're for beginners. The mechanics aren't too difficult. Are there kind of like deck lists in that like hey, these are kind of fun just to go mess around, like on Naboo or something.
Yeah, there's that Java format, which is a little less intimidating because it's you chop off the 5 strongest decks, we'll say, or 5 strongest current cards. But in terms of decks that are a little easier to play, that question is asked a bunch. It's kind of hard to address straightforward. But there's like Echo Base Operations, for example, is a old school deck that there's been a lot of good virtual card helpers for it. It's not a tier 1 deck, but it's pretty much you put a bunch of dudes on or dudettes on
Yeah,
off.
yeah,
You
hang out in
deploy
off.
activation operations, and then you just vomit all your starships into space. And if your opponent tries to be in space, you kick them out of space. And it's a pretty straightforward approach. There's some other deck like Black Sun. Well, Black Sun's pretty complicated. I wouldn't do that. Hunt Down is pretty straightforward. It's not the cheapest deck to build, but basically a bunch of dark side mains like Jedi's swinging lightsabers and trying to get rid of the Jedi. So it's a pretty straightforward deck, and I know some of the most experienced players in the game love Hunt Down. I know Matt Sokol, who was a 2000 world champion. He's still very active, very good player. He loves playing Huntdown. It's quick games. People are losing force to Visage of the Emperor, and you're just throwing mains versus mains in matchups. And if you're playing against non-mains light side decks, it's a little tough. But that actually reminds me real quick just of one other commonly asked question is, can I play both a virtual card and a non-virtual card with the same name in the same deck? Like there's an Imperial Decree and there's an Imperial Decree virtual. Well, Imperial Decree is a non-unique card, and both those cards sometimes are played in the same deck. So you might have them both on the table at the same time. But if there's a unique card, like for example, Visage of the Emperor, which made me think of this, you can't have Visage of the Emperor V on the table and also Visage of the Emperor at the Hollow Theater. So stuff like that. So, and like if you play Monarch, I think for Monarch, I always forget this, or Monarch or Grabbers, they do count as the same card. So like if you have a Darth Vader and a Darth Vader V in your hand and your opponent plays Grimtosh Losh, I might be wrong with that, but I'm pretty sure that they both go lost. It's something that never sticks with me. But those are some of the nuances with the V cards and cards that have just been like to get a V at the end of the name and they're a half slip or a C slip.
Okay, no, that's good to know. So I think we're gonna be wrapping up here. So I guess my last question for you is favorite V card. What's your
Yeah, so I would say, so like I said, I really like Agents of Black Sun, Huntdown, Prophet, are probably three of my favorite decks, two dark and one light. And Prophet got a starting interrupt called Rendezvous Point on Tatooine Virtual. So it's this card from Jabba's Palace, this rare that no one would probably ever play, but it's got a V card, it's a half slip, and it's a starting interrupt that the key aspect of it is it lets you deploy Seeking an Audience, a non-virtual card. There's actually a Seeking an Audience V and a Seeking the Audience non-V back from I think Jabba's Palace sealed deck, and that lets you get 3PO from your reserve deck. 3PO with his parts showing is a super powerful card even now from the Tatooine expansion. It pulls out R2, and there's a good R2V, and it also helps with protecting your force drains from like router operations or ISB operations because you can pull out underworld contacts. So I really like Rendezvous Point on Tatooine, and the really cool thing about that, it's a player card from Troy Biesterfield, who is the original creator of Jemp, who I would say is the most impactful volunteer of the 10-year span from 2010 to 2020. Like what creating Jemp, which anybody who knows anything about coding and anything that knows anything about the Star Wars customizable card game would probably think it's an impossible task. But it is amazing what is done, and the PC's helped a lot over the last several years to kind of steward, or not kind of, definitely steward Jemp, constantly add enhancements, make it a good free resource for players of all types, old school players, new school players, casual players, competitive players. It's used for majors during the pandemic. So big props to Troy, and I like that he made this Prophet card. One more quick point I do want to say, because I definitely didn't want to forget, but like with this uncut sheet with these AIs, like one of the cool things about virtual cards is we can do these alternate images, we can do foils, and use them. There's giveaways for a lot of different reasons, mostly for playing, active players playing in events. You get these foils, and people really like that. And that it's cool that it mimics like Decipher, where Decipher had foils, Decipher had alternate images, and that we can do that, especially the alternate images. A lot of times are better images, and they're just, the set was released, and then 2 years later, hey, we got this better image. Let's do this as an AI. So it's really neat from a collect, and that's what I'd like to do. I always like to use as many AIs and foils in my decks as possible, and it's just another neat aspect of V cards, that you can have these kind of alternate, pictures on your cards. It makes it just fun and look pretty.
I guess speaking of which, I should have mentioned this at minute 2, but we will be raffling off those 2 prizes that you showed. So to enter, all you need to do is just comment in the video, and I'll do sort of a random comment selected. We'll figure out the right timing to do that, and what's most appropriate after people have time to look at the video.
For the diligent listeners, the ones who listen all the way to the end.
I know. I that's what I was like. I should have said this.
We'll reward them. No, that's good. We'll reward the people that listen all the way through.
Make it to minute 34. Well, Jared, this has been a really great conversation. Thanks for hopping on, and I have a feeling we're gonna have some follow-up conversations in the future. And there's just a lot to explore here, and I appreciate you kind of helping explain V cards and dumbing it down for me and anyone else that has these questions, just doesn't know who to ask. I think the big thing that I found is the PC is there to help, and they are accessible. That they're not this like council of like Sith lords like that are like they're all volunteers. They're working to like keep this game going. And did I say they're volunteers? They're volunteers, right? And so
Yeah.
I think it's amazing what you guys are doing to kind of keep this going, and that helps kind of everybody, whether you're just a rookie player or even just kind of collecting. The fact is, like, everybody benefits from folks playing this game and thinking about this game, and it not just being another dead CCG, which there are plenty of those. Go over
Yeah.
to the dead CCG forum. There's a lot of them. They're
Yeah.
just absolute graveyards.
Mm. Yeah, no,
Uh,
thanks so much for having me. This is my pleasure. And yeah, it's a community with a lot of friendly people willing to help, willing to make it grow. And there's a lot of different platforms that people can reach out and ask for help, and people will help. So yeah, I can't thank you enough. This hopefully is a very helpful video to a lot of people.
yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, everyone have a good night. I guess
Mhm.
it's maybe night. I don't know.
Yep. Take care.